Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will begin momentarily. Hello, Tucson. Good morning, good morning, good morning. How is everybody this morning? Thank you so much for being here. I am Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live, which is the events division of the Atlantic magazine, and I'm so delighted to see such a packed house and to welcome you to Race and Justice Tucson. Sorry, I'm flying to Houston today. In any case, our gathering today is actually part of a multi-year exploration of race and criminal justice across the country. We launched this series 2 years ago in Washington, D.C., to bring to life the issues that our Atlantic correspondent Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about in a cover story for the magazine called The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Last year, we traveled to Los Angeles to explore justice, access, and equity in the country's demographic bellwether. And earlier this fall, we were in Charlotte, North Carolina, 1 year after Keith Lamont Scott was shot and killed by a police officer in that city. And now we're here with you in Tucson. Why? Yay, yay Tucson. Thank you, by the way, for the beautiful weather here. We came from the East Coast where it is just, I mean, I know it's not sunny, but it just feels so nice. You might ask, why did you choose to come to Tucson? This city and this county that you all call home has a rich culture and history. Indigenous tribes have lived here for thousands of years. And the region has changed hands between Mexico and the United States twice, and now it sits in the cross currents of immigration, trade, and cultural exchange. It's also clear that these are not easy times here, and despite the presence of big employers like the University of Arizona and Raytheon, economic growth has stagnated since the recession, and Tucson's recovery lags behind other cities in the Southwest. The economic divide here is even starker than in almost any other big city in the country. And nearly 30% of the children in this region live in poverty, and that's higher for those who are Latino, African American, or American Indian. And this is probably not news to anybody in this room, I'm quite sure. So today we're going to spend the morning trying to understand how all this plays out in the criminal justice system, where people of color make up nearly 2/3 of the jail population in a county that is still majority white. Before we begin that conversation, I do want to take a moment to say thank you. This gathering would not be possible without the support of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Thank you to them. You'll hear from the MacArthur team a little later this morning. And now just a few super practical notes. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away because we're on Twitter at Atlantic Live. I'd like to remind people that you now have 280 characters to play with, so you can go wild. The hashtag is RaceJusticeAZ. There are no spaces. And we want you to be part of the conversation in the room too, so please be ready with your questions throughout the morning. To kick us off with a conversation on the state of justice system in Pima County, please welcome Joel Feynman. He's the county's public defender. Welcome, Joel. Amelia Kramer, the Chief Deputy County Attorney. Presiding Judge Kyle Bryson. Mene Mejias is a reentry coordinator at the Pima Prevention Partnership. And County Administrator Chuck Huckleberry. And here to lead the conversation is my colleague, Atlantic Senior Editor, Ron Brownstein. Ron,
thank you.
All yours.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I'm not going to rat out exactly who, but one of our panelists on the way out asked me where the fog machine was for the WWE style entry. Thank you all for being with us. As Margaret mentioned, we have been around the country in a number of different cities over the last year or so with the support of the MacArthur Foundation, looking at how they are exploring issues relating to the criminal justice system. And one of the things that I think we have learned is that a challenge in this is even defining what we are trying to achieve. And there are very different definitions of what reform means. So I'd like to start by asking my panelists, what does a successful criminal justice system look like to you? What are the metrics by which we should measure whether we are creating a system that is more equitable, more just, and more effective at keeping people safe? Joel, can I start with you?
Sure, and as I think we spoke about a little bit before, I think one of the most meaningful metrics would be if most of the people on the stage were out of a job. If we had less police officers, less judges, less public defenders, less prosecutors. I think a more practical metric of success, which we're not seeing, Ron, is trend lines down. We're seeing the opposite. We're seeing more and more people of color incarcerated. We're seeing more and more felony filings. We're seeing more and more people in prison. We're seeing the United States persevere as the prison capital of the planet. So I think if we just start by trying to get the trend lines to go down instead of go up, then we'll at least have some idea that we're on the right path to success.
Amelia.
Well, I think that the MacArthur Foundation's challenge is aptly named safety and justice because those are the two key metrics that we need to always be moving toward. I just want to give an example of something that we observed at the beginning of the challenge when we began about a year and a half, 2 years ago. 2 cases in the same week. One man was arrested after law enforcement officers went to his home, knocked and announced, and he responded by firing his weapon at them. Fortunately, none of them was killed. They had bulletproof vests, et cetera. He was taken to the jail. A very wealthy man was able to post the high bond that was imposed upon him, and he was released. That same week, I went and observed our misdemeanor mental health court, which is a wonderful court. And there was a woman who was brought in her orange jumpsuit from the jail. She had been in custody for 45 days, pre-trial. She had been picked up on a warrant that was 2 years old for her failure to appear for her previous case. That underlying case from 2 years before was that she had stolen a candy bar. So the system is exactly backwards, where we had somebody who posed a dangerous, violent risk to the public safety of this community was out of custody while he was awaiting trial, and a woman with a mental illness who really needed treatment, which is what the plea was get her into treatment, was in custody. And what we're trying to do is to reverse that so that the right people, those who pose public safety risk, are in custody, but those who have mental illness, substance use disorders, and other medical problems are released from custody and given therapeutic interventions.
Judge.
Thanks, Ron. From the judicial perspective, I think the key component here is to move from anecdotal historical behavioral practices when these cases intersect with our judges and moving in toward an evidence-based practices model. We are in the process of working on that type of a model, and with the help of the MacArthur Foundation and other things that are going on, not just at the local level, but also at the state level through the Chief Justice's Task Force on Fair Justice for All. So it is at the forefront of our existence, and we're working hard to make sure that that's what we're doing as a culture.
Manny, what does a successful system look like to you? How should it be measured?
Well, first and foremost, I agree that therapy is key. You know, people just don't decide one day, they don't wake up one day and decide that they're going to be a criminal. Things happen. So I think therapy needs to take place, but I also think that our punishment system really needs to be looked at. It's not what society thinks it is. It's not what you see in the movies. It's really, really different, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to give you a glimpse of what that's like. Yeah,
we'll talk more about that in a minute. You have to pay a lot of the bills for this, so how does, you have to sign the checks. What does success, what does reform look like? What does it mean to you?
2 things, really. One is better outcomes from those that are either involved in the system or entwined in the system. And then I think reducing cost overall. We spend this last year in our criminal justice system local taxpayers' monies of about $284 million. That's $46 million more than it was 10 years ago. And that's money that can't be spent on job training, education, treatment, all the things that are necessary to try and intercept these folks who get involved in this system.
And just to give perspective, that $284 million would be what share of the total budget?
Unfortunately, it's about 60% of what we call our general fund. And so when people talk about benefits from public local governments, they talk about, you know, no potholes in the roads, better parks, bicycle paths, those type of things. Criminal justice expenditures at 60%, it's really hard to measure the outcomes, and most taxpayers don't even understand how much money is being invested in that system.
the cost is one reason why the county is participating in this effort with MacArthur, who is our, to be clear, our sponsor here today, to reduce the average daily population in the jail. When you started in 2014, you had a daily average of 2,136 people in the jail. The goal is to reduce that by 25% by 2019, to get it down to 1,574. You are at 1860 today. You had some improvement, but it's kind of slowed down lately. Amelia, is the county on track to meet its goals, and what will it take to do that?
Well, I hope we'll meet that goal. We are on track in some areas. For example, talked about someone with a misdemeanor arrest who was in custody for a lengthy period of time. The percentage of individuals in the jail pretrial who have been arrested on misdemeanors has shrunk tremendously. So what we have today, predominantly in our jail, is those who are accused of felony crimes, more serious crimes. But certainly more progress needs to be done. I think the pretrial services changes that we've made with screening and assessment has prompted more judges to release those who are non-dangerous and non-violent into the community with supervision and therapeutic interventions, and that's been part of the reason that we've been moving in the right direction.
Joel, on track or not to meet the goals, and either way, if so, why?
No, we're not. Every year, we file more felony cases than the year before. Every year, we charge more people with drugs than we charge with anything else. In fiscal year 2016, 2017, the Pima County Attorney filed drug charges against 36% of all the people accused of felonies. That's the highest percentage of anybody. The people who go to the Pima County Jail for drugs, a plurality of them, are there for possession of less than 1 gram of narcotic, 1 gram being a sugar packet. Until we fundamentally rethink how we are arresting and prosecuting people and what we are arresting and prosecuting them for, until we fundamentally redefine what a violent crime is, what a drug crime is, what a crime is, then I don't think we are going to see anything but very small improvements with a lot of steps backwards, because we have defined ourselves into a system of mass incarceration. And until we redefine ourselves out of it, I just don't see us achieving the goals we want.
And you've made the point, and you've made the point that even improvement may still, even if you improve, you may still end up at a level that is much higher than a generation ago.
So in 1968, we imprisoned 100 out of every 100,000 Americans. In 2017, we imprisoned 720 out of every 100,000 Americans. So even if we improve by half, we are still 3 times worse than we were in 1968. 1 out of every 3 African Americans will be arrested at some point in his life, 1 out of every 3 African American men. How do we meaningfully swing the pendulum back? Is 1 out of every 4 an improvement? Is 1 out of every 5 an improvement? I mean, if we were talking about Caucasian men, 1 out of every 7 Caucasian men being arrested at some point in their life, there'd be a political upheaval in this country. So we really need to get to the core of things. And until we agree on how to do that, then I think it's going to be difficult to meet those goals.
Judge Amelia pointed to one of the areas that I think a lot of communities around the country are grappling with. I believe 80% of the people in your jail are in a pretrial situation, correct? And that's true in many communities. And they are struggling with how do you shift the basis for who stays in and who gets out to risk rather than financial capacity. Where is Pima County in dealing on that continuum of making that shift? What are the obstacles to doing so?
Well, we have a very vibrant, pretrial services division and have for 4 decades. And, but most recently, even though that group has had a validated risk assessment tool in place, the envy of the country in many ways, we were recently presented with the opportunity to utilize the Arnold Foundation risk assessment tool. And our pretrial services department, headed by Domingo Corona, embraced that as an opportunity to, again, try to focus on the utilization of evidence-based practices as opposed to historical, anecdotal decision-making when somebody comes before you, to make that, at that intersection, that decision about should that individual be incarcerated pending trial or not.
Chuck, an issue for in communities has been, if you move toward a risk-based system, a lot of places are kind of like the revenue that the existing system creates, and fines and fees and so forth. To what extent does the desire or the need for the revenue impede reform?
It probably is one of the major factors, and what happens is everyone looks at this revenue and fees and fines and says, well, there's a lot of money there. Well, there's no money for local governments. I mean, it all goes to state or to other pots of money, and so it's just kind of an illusion. And so it's not real. It's this artificial, okay, kind of incentive that basically cost everybody more money in the long run by many factors.
Manny, I think in a lot of places, we have public defenders and DAs and police departments all grappling with the issue of, if for fiscal reasons, if for no other, how do we reduce prison populations now, which are consuming more and more of local and state budgets? But it's not often it's not as easy for the people kind of in the system to have their voices heard. If you were asked, and I guess I am asking you now, what are the keys to reducing the number of people who are incarcerated? Where would you begin? What is the point? As you say, you don't wake up and decide to be a criminal. Where is the point at which you think there is the maximum leverage to make a difference?
I think education and therapy. A very good friend of mine once told me, she read a statement to me, and I'd like to read it to you real quick. She said, those who commit crimes against themselves or against society more often than not commit those crimes because at one time a crime was committed against them. And then she turned around and said, I'm going to replace one word. And she said, those who commit harm against themselves or against society more often than not commit that harm because a harm is committed against them. So again, I think if we focus on therapy and education, we would get the turnaround that we're looking for.
Yeah, to that point, and again, this is not unique here, but 60%, the figure I've seen, of the people in the jail have some kind of mental health issue. Have the jails become the mental health provider of last resort? Yes?
I think the answer is yes.
I think that jails have become the mental health provider of first resort if you are anything but an upper-class member of American society. If you have problems with insurance, and now, thanks to our national government, more and more of us do. If you have problems paying for your health care out of pocket, and thanks to certain economic conditions, more and more of us do, then you're not getting adequate mental health care. You're getting mental health care, if you do, when you get arrested, when it's too late.
What are the options, Judge? You have someone, you're now, as I understand it, as part of this effort, you are now screening everyone, correct?
Correct.
For mental health. Talk a little bit about that, and then what you can do when somebody comes back and says, look, the person in front of you actually is dealing with a mental health issue.
Sure.
What are your options?
Well, first, again, I want to stress that we have a robust pretrial services department, and they do a lot of very in-depth risk assessment. When those folks then come to the court has a variety of options. We have a mental health court, we have drug treatment alternative to prison court, drug court, and that's at superior court level. At the limited jurisdiction court levels, they have those types of courts as well. So we do have the ability, once we have that information, and the county attorney wishes to have those cases in that process to get those folks.
So maybe let's talk about this from your point of view. There is now more screening. What does that information, what does that provide to you? What does it enable you to do that you could not do before?
Well, there's screening both by pretrial services, and then also our county attorney, Barbara Lawal, has innovated some programs that have screening beyond that. So one of the things we're able to do is to assess whether someone's suffering from a mental illness or substance use disorder and craft a plea agreement with them that would give them an alternative to incarceration as their consequence for their criminal activity. The county attorney in our county, Barbara Lawal, instituted a drug treatment alternative to prison program for individuals who are repetitive convicted felons on cases where they would otherwise be going to prison, now go to residential drug treatment, get wraparound recovery support services, and we have a rolling 65% success rate with regards to that. It's exactly the inverse of the failure rate we have with recidivism of folks coming out of prison. We also just worked recently to establish, and it's still in the pilot phases, a drug diversion program for individuals arrested for the first time for felony drug possession, and we've worked in close collaboration with the Public Defender's Office on that program. That involves a screening and assessment up front, and then the appropriate clinically determined intervention, whether it's residential treatment, intensive outpatient, or if the person is not an addict, a class. So we're trying to use evidence-based best practices and provide the most appropriate therapeutic intervention to reduce recidivism. That helps both the defendant to get out of the criminal justice system, to avoid the collateral consequences of a felony conviction, which is a real problem in many areas, and to be able to become a productive tax-paying member of the community, take care of their children, take care of their elderly relatives, and those sorts of things.
Go ahead.
We recognized back in 2006 that our jail was the largest mental health treatment provider in the county, and decided that what we needed to do is basically create an alternative to where people in behavioral health crisis or on the edge of becoming incarcerated could be taken, and that's why we built a crisis recovery center. Asked the voters in 2006 to do that, and they did, and they approved $20 million in bonds to build that facility.
I mean, there's obviously an equity case for treating someone who has a substance abuse or mental health problem in a treatment environment rather than a incarceration environment. Is there a fiscal case for it too? Is it more or less expensive to treat someone outside or inside of
It's orders of magnitude more expensive to treat on the inside as opposed to the outside, an outpatient in a managed care environment. And I think, what we really need to do is make sure that while we provide the physical facilities, is that we need to provide the systems that provide the support to those individuals to keep them in outpatient treatment so that basically they don't degrade and revert back to becoming an inmate in our jail.
Manny, Amelia, referred to the high rate of recidivism in Arizona. The American Friends Services Committee report, we're going to hear a little more from that later on one of the panels, had for me, a pretty striking statistic that half of the prisoners in the state system are back within 3 years after being released. You work a lot with formerly incarcerated people. What are the keys to keeping people in a positive direction once they get out?
Well, first and foremost, it's the struggle that they face when they're first released. Housing and employment are two major factors that they have to come against when they're first released, and that's very, very difficult. I know many individuals who can't get a job simply because of their record or because they have a record, and they have no choice but to revert to other things to try to make it happen. It's either be cold and be hungry or do what I got to do to survive. So it's really, really hard to try to get that break, which is why I'm very thankful for things like Tucson Second Chance, Pima Reentry. I'm celebrating 9 years of freedom. 9 years ago, this stuff barely. Thank you. 9 years ago, these things barely got started. They barely got off the ground. And when I got informed about them, I was very thankful. And I kept telling everybody it was bittersweet. It's sweet because I see that you guys are doing all these things now, but it's bitter because where were you when I was released? So I'm very thankful for things like that. But those are two major factors that people face right off the bat. And
where can they turn? What's available?
Well, there's Tucson Second Chance, which helps formerly incarcerated people find employment. Housing, it's a good friend of mine, Rachel Beatty from the Southwest Fair Housing. I go to her often when I have a client that needs someplace to go. I'm still looking around and still trying to find it. Everybody's doing their own separate things, and we're just trying to work together. We're trying to figure out how we can start working together more. So.
Is there a tension between reducing the incarcerated population, whether in local jails, state prisons, federal prisons, and public safety? Are the two in conflict? Is there a risk to public safety in reducing the population? So let me start with you.
Well, there could be, but the way that we're doing it in Pima County, there's not. And so I think that when we talk about risk, sometimes it's the risk to reoffend, but reoffend in what capacity? So if someone is arrested in the park for trespassing and marijuana is found in his pocket, the risk of him reoffending is not a threat to the public safety of the community. If he doesn't show up for his court hearing, maybe there's another way to get him there than to have him incarcerated for 2 weeks prior to that court hearing. On the other hand, if somebody attempts a homicide or commits a sexual assault, that person may be dangerous, and the best way to isolate them from endangering the community while they await trial when there's already been a finding of probable cause that they committed that crime by a judge, is to keep them in custody until we can adjudicate that case. I think that's what we're trying to do here in Pima County, and I think that's the right way to go about it. We don't want to just willy-nilly let everybody free because you'll have sexual assaults, domestic violence, armed robberies, those sorts of things we can't afford in the community. On the other hand, as Mr. Feynman indicated, a number of people who are arrested on felonies or for drug felonies, a number of people arrested for misdemeanors that are nonviolent, non-dangerous, those folks can probably be safely allowed out in the community. One real innovation that we have under this safety and justice challenge is electronic monitoring with remote breathalyzer for individuals with DUI offenses, both pretrial and then post-conviction, who would otherwise be in the jail. They can be safely allowed out in the community on that monitoring, and so they no longer need to be in custody. And so that's the type of thing we're trying to do, is to innovate with technology, with treatment, with monitoring, and those sorts of things to avoid incarceration for anyone who does not pose a public safety risk.
Joel, is there attention?
Tremendous. The risk to public safety is what we're doing now. 2016, 2017, 1% of felony filings in Pima County were for homicide. 6% were for sex crimes. So we put sex crimes and homicides together, 7% of all felonies, okay? As you said, according to the wonderful work of the American Friends Service Committee, half of all people who are in prison have been in prison before. That's the risk to public safety. And let's try and use a metaphor here. If the Ford Motor Company came out with a new car with a new kind of steering wheel, and they said, this steering wheel is great, it works half the time, that car would never be allowed on the roads. But yet it's okay because it's criminal justice. It's okay because it doesn't work in the context of poor people and colored people. And it's okay because it is a system that we use to fund through fear. It's not okay. And it's not working for our larger community. I mean, it doesn't meaningfully, imprisonment hasn't meaningfully impacted crime rates. Imprisonment hasn't meaningfully impacted drug use. Imprisonment hasn't meaningfully impacted any of the metrics we traditionally use, and yet we keep doing it over and over and over. That's the threat.
Judge, one of the things that is striking here is you have a state that has some very harsh or tough, depending on how you want to look at it, sentencing laws. Truth in sentencing that was adopted by many states after the 1994 crime bill. Most places have rolled that back. The truth in sentencing requiring 85% of a sentence to be served. Most places have rolled that back for nonviolent offenses. Arizona is one of the 3 states that have not done any change on the nonviolent side. How much does state law and state rules limit what can be done on reform at the local level or affect it?
Well, judges at the forefront, I must tell you, swear an oath to support the Constitution and laws of the state of Arizona. So that's where it all starts. Judges don't have a lot of ability to have flexibility within the confines of the sentencing guidelines. The courts do have the ability to find mitigating factors and aggravating factors on the other end of the spectrum. But within that context and those confines, the judge must use those sentencing guidelines.
What are the most important things the state could do that would give you, in your mind, more flexibility to create a more equitable system?
Well, it starts with a culture change, and I think that's a common denominator for this whole discussion. And how that happens, I don't know. I'm not a politician. But it begins perhaps with a grassroots movement, contacting legislators, indicating to those folks enough, and perhaps judges do need more flexibility.
Coming here from, obviously not being an expert on local conditions, but coming here from a national perspective, one of the things that is most striking about where we are is that you are on the border at a time when issues about the border are as politicized as they have probably been since James Polk launched the Mexican-American War in 1848, which Abraham Lincoln opposed, which is kind of interesting. All right, so what are the unique challenges, if any, that are created for public safety challenges that are created for this community by being on the border? How does it change your equation?
Really, it shouldn't, and it probably doesn't. In fact, I think the border's probably safer than most of the urban areas in any city in the country. I happen to have a home in Mexico and a home here, and have no qualms about either place. I'm probably safer there than here. And so I think that it's just this made-up kind of hysteria that we have on the border that is just, it's not rational, and it basically is impeding trade and commerce across the border that we should be working on and enjoying, because as we improve our economy, we can do other things with the money, such as education or job training, and basically making better investments.
The state, for several years, back to SB 1070, has been embroiled in a debate and litigation over what is the proper role for local law enforcement on immigration issues. Now with Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, there's a whole new set of pressures from the federal level. What do you think of the balance that Pima County, and Tucson City Police have struck? Do you feel at this point that they have a productive role, or are they going too far in one direction or the other?
It's going to sound strange as a public defender, but I'm thankful that we have Chief Magnus, and I'm thankful that we have Sheriff Napier. I much prefer working with those gentlemen than with the former sheriff of Maricopa County. I think in Pima County, we have our issues with law enforcement, as every other county does, and law enforcement has its issues with undocumented immigrants, as every county does. But I think that when it comes to the immigration issue, we are particularly fortunate in that in Sheriff Napier and Chief Magnus, we have two gentlemen who are, I think, uniquely sensitive to not only the political climate of this county, but to seeing to protecting the rights of people who are in this county, whether they're documented or undocumented.
Manny, because one of the issues that has come up, certainly since President Trump took office, is this question of whether this atmosphere of heightened enforcement will make undocumented individuals or families less likely to report other crimes, or more fearful about coming forward on other crimes, and actually diminish public safety in the community. To what extent do you see that? Is there a fear for folks who may be in a domestic violence situation or some other kind of circumstance to interact with law enforcement out of fear of being caught up in a net?
Honestly, that fear has always been there, regardless of who was in power or who the president was. Depends on what neighborhood you go through, or you come up in. There's some neighborhoods you don't call cops. It's just the way it is because of fear, for whatever reason.
And no different now?
No different now.
No. Amelia, what are you seeing on that front?
I think Manny's correct. I mean, we see victims of domestic violence, sex trafficking, sexual abuse, although they are entitled to a U visa or a T visa that would allow them to stay in the country if they cooperate with law enforcement and prosecution, we see that sometimes they're very fearful of coming forward. In fact, perpetrators of domestic violence sometimes use the threat of reporting an individual to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement authorities as a vehicle for that power and control, that coercive power and control that repeats the cycle of domestic violence. And I think when we talk about the border, there are two predominant issues that we think about. One is immigration, which has nothing to do with the local criminal justice system, and one is border crimes. And we do see trafficking in heroin and methamphetamine coming across the southern border into the United States, right through this community up the interstates and trafficked out across the country. I think that may be a significant reason why we have more methamphetamine, for example, in this community than in eastern parts of the country or northern parts of the country, as well as heroin and other opioids that we see people suffering from. So I think the immigration laws are an impediment to victims coming forward in crimes. I do see some border-related crimes, particularly in the area of drug trafficking, and that leads to, unfortunately, more addiction in this area. And we're trying to address the demand through therapies and interventions to reduce that demand so that at the same time as we're trying to interdict the supply of those drugs coming across the border.
I want to bring in the audience in a minute for their questions, but can I ask each of you, Amelia and Joel, the same question I asked the judge before, which is, what would you like to see from the state? How does state law affect the way you can do your job? And what do you think, what changes at the state level would be most advantageous?
Well, I guess from my perspective, criminal justice reinvestment. So the county attorney's office established in 2011 this drug treatment alternative to prison program. And 3 separate cost-benefit studies have shown that it costs less than half the cost of prison. We have saved literally millions of dollars from the State Department of Corrections by providing therapeutic interventions at less than half the cost here in the county. So what we would like to see is some of those millions of dollars that we've saved the Department of Corrections reinvested into further therapeutic interventions right here in Pima County.
Joel?
I'd like to see a different state legislature. And I'd like to see lobbyists from law enforcement and the Pima County Attorney's Office lobby for modification of truth in sentencing laws, lobby for the decriminalization of marijuana, lobby for more money for rehabilitation and less money for prisons. Until the rubber hits the road, so to speak, then our protestations and our insistence upon reform does not mean much. It means a great deal more when those lobbyists sit down and have lunches with those state legislators.
You talked about kind of the impact on the local budget, but again, in the same report, which we'll hear a little bit more later, another kind of head-turning statistic, from 2000 to 2017 at the state level, spending on universities is down 26%. Spending on economic security is down 24%. Spending on K-12 is essentially static, up 3% over a decade. Spending on corrections is up 28% at the state level. It's kind of chewing through the budget.
Yeah, it's a substitution factor, and so what you spend on criminal justice, you can't spend on education, and kind of that's where we find ourselves. And I think, you know, the legislature and everybody had the mantra of get tough on crime in the 90s. You know, I think that you ought to basically reinvent the mantra and call get smart on crime in the 2020s, because it's going to require
and what's the biggest barrier to doing that? No, your thought.
Biggest barrier to doing that is again, getting a legislature to understand the direct relationship between the finite pot of money that taxpayers can provide for governmental services, and then allocating that in a smart way that basically grows the economy and basically improves the outcomes for the people who are in the community and in the state. And that means reinvesting and investing in education and workforce training, trying to grow wealth in the community, economic development. It doesn't mean building more prisons.
Yeah, let's go to the audience. Let's bring in some questions. We have some microphones, I think. Let's see. There we go. Just identify yourself, please, to start.
Dustin Williams, Pima County School Superintendent, elected for the schools. One of the barriers that we see in our juvenile detention center and the jails is at that state legislature and those policies and procedures. And the legislature doesn't want to fund and does not fund our 18 to 21-year-olds to be educated, nor do they want to pay the full 100 cents on the dollar. They want to pay 72 cents on the dollar. If it wasn't for Chuck Huckleberry and our county supervisors to help us out, we would have had to fire teachers. What is the message for our legislature to make this more equal? And do you support policy and procedures to equalize that payment for the students that are incarcerated and to obviously educate students that are 18 to 21?
Anybody want to jump in? Chuck?
Well, I think, yeah, education is key, but I think at the same time, both in the juvenile detention facility as well as the adult detention facility, there needs to be a renewed interest in job training so that those who basically are detained in those facilities gain some skills so they can become employed once they're released, so they can, as they're employed, earn money to basically support a different lifestyle.
And if I can just add anecdotally, Ron,
Yes.
The juvenile detention facility, when constructed in the late 90s, around 2000, was built to house, 300 kids? I talked with a juvenile court presiding judge just this morning, and they have 35 kids in that facility. So inroads have been made at that model court. It's been the envy, really, of the juvenile courts across the country in a lot of its programs.
Yes, right up in front. Go ahead. Just identify yourself.
Barbara Lawal, Pima County Attorney. One of the biggest barriers that I see toward creating any of the kind of change that most of you have talked about is the state legislature's insistence on private prisons. And until we end that, we are not going to be able to do anything with regards to lobbying about sentencing, truth in sentencing, or anything else. And it is a financial incentive to them and their friends who run these prisons and the corporations, and we can't even get in to talk to them about it without them shutting the door.
Any reaction?
I agree with Ms. Lawal. I mean, private prisons are an abomination. I fundamentally disagree with her that that's part of the problem. I don't think the 15% of Arizonans who are in private prisons compared to the 85% of Arizonans who are in public prisons, I don't think that has anything to do with felony filing numbers and the number of charges that Ms. Lawal files against them. And in fact, we're repeatedly told that the felony filing decision has absolutely nothing to do with the sentencing decision that's supposed to be left up to the judge. So whether somebody goes to public prisons or private prisons, what we need to talk about is how people get into the system to begin with. And until we stop funneling people into the system, then we're just, again, nibbling around the edges.
Did you want to add?
Private prisons, what happens, the state rigs the game. They do the typical cost-benefit analysis and talk about total cost and prisoner housing per day. And what they fail to do is normalize the game, because what happens is in a public setting, you're paying correction officers a retirement plan. In a private setting, you're paying absolutely nothing in retirement. So they rig the game to make the numbers come out and therefore give some incentives to privatize and basically have corporations come in and build prisons to house people for profit.
Yes, over there.
Hi, my name is Shauna Follis. I am a PhD student at the University of Arizona. And my question is more kind of how politics interact with culture. So in a system that we know mass incarceration doesn't exist in isolation, it exists in a white supremacist system in the USA. Thanks. I think we all know there needs to be a cultural change. Who are we giving our voices to? Why are our panels that are being paid to have a voice on this and being financed, why are they white? Why are the experts in this room all white? And why haven't we discussed this? If we know that white supremacy is a cultural issue leading to race and justice, why aren't we including black experts?
Well, not speaking on behalf of all of society, there are going to be experts, African American experts later in the panels, but in the event, it's not kind of monolithic at all. But it does go. Your question does go to the kind of issue of who is being heard as these decisions are being made, right? I mean, that is. I mean, kind of more broadly, I think, I'm not trying to deflect your question, but I'm just trying to kind of enlarge it. And Manny, I asked you this before, in these debates, as you hear legislators debating with public defenders, with county prosecutors, to what extent do you feel like the perspective of people who have actually been through the system being heard, and how different would the debate sound if they were?
Well, I'm glad that you said that. Let me say this real quick. I sit up here as an expert by experience, as a formerly system-involved person, so my area of expertise is a little different than my other panelists here. Glenn Martin from Just Leadership USA once said that those closest to the problem are those closest to the solution. So I agree with you. I think that there should be more people of color, there should be more victims, and more system-involved people up here, because we're the ones that need to have this conversation. We're the ones that have that voice. And I just want to add real quick that I do want to stand up for victims' rights. I always have to make sure that I say this. Even though I'm a system-involved person or formerly incarcerated, victims do have rights. And I don't want to stand up here and say that I didn't do anything wrong or I didn't deserve the punishment for the crime that I committed. What I am up here saying is what was decided for me didn't help. It made things worse. And here after the fact, 9 years after the fact, I'm still struggling. And so these are the conversations, again, I'm glad you said that people need to understand. I've been out for 9 years and I'm still struggling. It's still very, very difficult for me to try to live amongst you people. And I'm not a citizen. I don't have my rights back. I wake up every day asking myself, what does it mean to be free? The things that you take for granted, I have to try to figure out. And there's no support groups for people like me. So, ma'am, I am glad that you brought that up, and I hope that we do invite more victims, more system-involved people, more people of color to have these conversations.
Well, you've given us a very strong kind of final statement on the very real human stakes and consequences of this debate. So with that, will you join me in thanking this panel, and we'll turn you over to the next segment. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, for a session produced by the MacArthur Foundation, please welcome Robert Suro, the director of the Tomas Rivera Policy Institute at the University of Southern California, and Lori Garducki, the criminal justice program director at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
So, good morning, Tucson. I appreciate the lively conversation that we had already this morning, and we're going to add, I think, to the conversation with engaging Roberto here, who's a professor at USC and director of the Tomas Rivera Center there, who also has a track record as a journalist, in a conversation about some of the other issues that are related to race and justice. But first, I want to do a shout out to Pima County. I think while the panel this morning did suffer from a lack of people of color as experts, I do want to point out those are the elected and appointed officials that represent you in the Safety and Justice Challenge. And it's unusual to have the collaboration among the different agency stakeholders where you can have a civil discourse between the public defender, the prosecuting attorney, the county official, formerly incarcerated individual, as well as the presiding judge of Pima County. And that's why we selected Pima, because they've made a commitment to safely reduce over-incarceration at the front end of the system, where most of the attention has been focused on sentencing reform in prisons. We all recognize that the misuse and overuse of jails is a major driver of mass incarceration in the United States. And I think that they gave you the statistics which led MacArthur to make this investment in the Safety and Justice Challenge. So thank you first to Pima County, and thank you to our partners at the Atlantic for putting on this forum and enabling all of you to participate in what I hope you find a very fruitful and productive conversation. So Pima has signed up not only to reduce over-incarceration, but to tackle racial and ethnic disparities. And one of the issues that has come up as we've worked across 40 jurisdictions in 25 states across the country is, what is this intersection between immigration and public safety? So Roberto, I know you've been doing a lot of thinking and writing about this issue. What's your perspective on that?
Well, to start, I think it's important to put some dimensions around the question of how you relate public safety to immigration, and to recall that the foreign-born population is no different than the native population, that the vast majority of those people are law-abiding individuals who pose no threat to public safety, and who, in fact, it's impossible to have an effective law enforcement system or effective criminal justice system without their enthusiastic cooperation, particularly in dealing with the number of people in that population or any other population who might be lawbreakers or threats to public safety. There's been a lot of rhetoric criminalizing the immigrant population as a whole, which introduces a real distortion to this conversation. So I think it's important to remember that we're talking about a substantial population here, almost 13% of Pima County, whose cooperation, whose enthusiastic cooperation with all of the measures we just discussed here is essential to their success, and who are themselves people who have a specific individual interest in seeing the success of the criminal justice system.
So do you think that there's a conflict then in terms of of asking local law enforcement who is concerned about public safety and what has come into play, at least in the news, around immigration control.
I mean, something that's developed really now going back at least 20 years and even a little bit earlier is the conflation of criminal justice and immigration control. And they really are very separate public policy imperatives and require different approaches to this population. The public safety challenge, as I mentioned, requires the enthusiastic cooperation of citizens who might be victims, witnesses, or otherwise pose no threat to public safety. Immigration controls, particularly as they've evolved with this administration, which targets a very broad swath of people, poses the risk of creating a disincentive to cooperation with the public safety system. So if people are unwilling to report crimes or serve as witnesses, if victims are unwilling to come forward, it handicaps the public safety effort at the very beginning in the most essential of its functions. And that's especially true in a place like Pima County, which in addition to having a resident immigrant population is also a transit area, 65 miles from the border. There's a lot of all kinds of traffic that flow through Pima County, most of it legitimate, most of it legal, most of it law-abiding. You need the cooperation of the people involved in that transit to assist in the policing of those people who are transiting through Pima County who are committing crimes. You can't have an effective law enforcement strategy without the enthusiastic cooperation of the entire population. When you conflate immigration controls over civil violations of immigration statutes with the need to ensure public safety, the public safety function suffers in that equation. And there's no evidence that robust immigration controls, the large-scale removals that we saw under the Obama administration, significantly improve public safety.
So let's talk about the ways in which Pima and other jurisdictions participating in the Safety and Justice Challenge have committed to a more effective, fair, more just and equitable system where the emphasis in law enforcement and courts and corrections is in public safety, and so keeping people out of the system is important. How do you see that as contributing to a more fair and humane immigration policy?
Well, we've heard already today about a range of interesting policies and initiatives undertaken here that aim at reducing the number of people who end up in jail in various ways. When you reduce charges, when you deflect people from felonies, when you're dealing with the foreign-born, that reduces the likelihood that they're going to face removal in some way or another. So a lot of these measures actually have an additional effect in terms of potentially creating a more cooperative atmosphere for the foreign-born to deal with the public safety system. If you know that for a minor, nonviolent offense, that you're not going to enter into a situation where you could end up facing removal, you're much more likely to cooperate. If it's a family member who's facing who has committed that sort of offense, you're much more likely to be cooperative with the larger public safety mission. You have to remember that when an individual encounters the law enforcement system for a nonviolent minor offense and ends up facing removal, you're taking something that might have been resolved with a fine or community service and inflicting a punishment that requires somebody leaving their home, their job, their family, breaking ties with a country they may have lived in for years. And we're talking talking here about legal permanent residents as well, and people who have followed all the rules and have committed an offense that the criminal justice system considers minor, but that has enormous collateral consequences as an immigrant, and consequences for American citizen children, for American citizen spouses, broadly. And so to the extent that these programs reduce the likelihood that a minor offense can lead to removal, I think it produces a more humane and more effective form of both criminal justice and immigration control.
So these policies aren't really particularly innovative. They're common sense. Some of the practices of reducing felonies to misdemeanors, citations in lieu of arrests, limiting the kinds of offenses that need to be brought to ICE's attention, those are not complex issues.
I wish that was true.
Okay.
And I wish common sense is the way we decided public policies.
Well, thank you, Roberto, for sharing your insights. I hope that we've set up a further conversation with our next panel in discussing these issues. It's not often I sit in a room where the public defender does a shout out for law enforcement in Pima County, but I look forward to continuing this conversation. So please join me in thanking Roberto for his perspective. Thanks.
And now, for a conversation with the region's law enforcement leadership, please welcome Tucson Police Chief Chris Magnus and Pima County Sheriff Mark Napier, here with the Atlantic's Ron Brownstein.
Give us a little room to spread out. Chief, Sheriff, thank you both for joining us. Let me start by asking you the question that I asked the previous panel. You obviously have to balance a lot of considerations in doing your job: public safety, equity, maintaining stability in communities. How do you define, when you think about the issue of criminal justice reform, how do you define a successful criminal justice system? What are the metrics of success? What should the system be trying to achieve?
Well, I think the easy answer is that we've got to get away from crime counts, bean counting, as the only measure of success in criminal justice, because that's failed us. I've been in this line of work for 36 years, and it has not produced the results that we'd want to, counting beans. How many people did we arrest? How many of this? That's an inaccurate measure. I think that to some extent you've got to look and be engaged in the community to understand what the community wants of law enforcement, which understandably varies from community to community. I think Tucson and Pima County is a very unique community that has different expectations of law enforcement than you might find in other parts of the country. And so I think it's incumbent upon law enforcement leaders like Chief Magnus and myself to be out in the community and to be listening and to be more responsive to the requirements of the
So what would some of those other metrics look like in terms of being responsive to the community? What do people look for that is different than, say, the crime rate?
Well, I think that the evidence in this crowd and this event today is that the focus on social justice is how can we move the ball forward? How can we make the playing field more level? How can we reduce the level of disparate incarceration in our country? In my jail, there are 1,900 people in my jail this morning. That is a tremendous amount of incarceration in our community, and as the county administrator says, it has an impact on tax dollars. Those tax dollars are otherwise not spent on other pursuits. So I think that this community expects social justice, expects us to be a part of the community rather than an island unto ourselves. And I think that type of engagement is more a measure of metrics of success than bean counting.
Chief, what does success look like to you?
I think success looks like a community that feels that their police are legitimate, that they are treated in a way that is procedurally just, that people feel they're treated with respect and dignity, even in an enforcement situation, that they are actually listened to, and that they have a real say in deciding what the priorities are for public safety and law enforcement in the community. I think that, you know, a police agency that listens and that builds relationships is one that can really create a climate of public safety, and legitimacy. So I think those are the key ingredients.
You know, in terms of the safety, Tucson's like a lot of cities, most cities across the country, where your violent crime rate, the bean counting, is much lower than it was in the 1990s, vastly lower than it was at kind of the high point in the early 1990s. But it has ticked back up statistically here, as in many places over the last year or so. As best you can tell, is something real changing? Or is it too early to tell? Do you feel as though there is actually an uptick in crime?
I think that the bean counting would tell us there is, but you need a long enough horizon to try to determine what the variables in society are that may be prompting that apparent escalation, and whether that's a sustained thing or a blip on the map. We're hoping it's a blip on the map. As you pointed out, the recovery here in Tucson, the economic recovery, has not been as robust as it has been in other parts of the country. Our education system is not appropriately funded. So there are a lot of things. I think one time when we look at law enforcement or the criminal justice system, it's not an island. It's not an island that is unaffected by other variables in society, whether that be employment, education, equality, other things impact those crime counts. And to look at law enforcement or criminal justice as it exists on an island unaffected by those other variables is a mistake. So we need to look at a larger picture.
Chief, what do you say about what's happening here?
No, I totally agree with that. I think part of the challenge is that for too long we have looked at policing or law enforcement as sort of an entity in its own right, unaffected by these other dynamics. And we have to do better with that, because there's no question that, you know, how we engage folks who have mental illness in our community is a significant challenge. How we deal with addiction, homelessness, all of these are contributing factors to public safety in a community, and yet none of these are things that law enforcement can do on their own. They really have to involve partnerships, meaningful collaborations that go further than just talk. And that's where I think we have made a lot of progress in this county and in this community, because people really are working together in, I think, some very innovative ways. But I do worry that we are in a climate where there is a broader sense of fear among a large portion of our population, particularly persons of color. We have a large, I think, undocumented community in Tucson and in this area, and I worry that a climate of fear about reporting crime, about being a witness to crime, about working with the police from the standpoint of prevention, these things will be affected by this larger sort of narrative that's going on that I think is not constructive or
Let's
positive.
bookmark the mental health issue and the undocumented issue and come back to them both in a moment. But I'm struck in the way you've talked about this. You know, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, has basically argued that reform and safety are in tension, and made the case that one of the reasons why many cities have seen an uptick in violent crime is because they are too focused on changing the way police departments and sheriffs interact, particularly with minority communities. Do you view those goals as incompatible or complementary?
No, I think that's a false statement. If you looked at crime as a public health problem, how would you attack it? Would you only seek to fix the sick people, or would you try to prevent the illness? And that's where we really miss the boat in law enforcement, is we're not in the criminal justice system. If we were approaching it as we have cancer, well, we know that there's been a great outreach to keep people from getting cancer, and then to do better interventions before the cancer becomes stage 4 melanomas. You can't treat the patient anymore. Unfortunately, the criminal justice system has been thrust into the point of having to treat the very, very ill patients, and then we decry the fact that we have hospitals, which would be in this case analogous to jails. What we need to do is to fix the public health problem, is to do better intervention at the front end so we don't have the very ill patients at the back end. And we don't do that. And I think that requires a synergistic approach between education, employment, equality. As long as there's social and racial economic inequalities in this country, there will be people that act out in criminogenic ways out of social strain. And anybody that thinks there's a level playing field in this country is simply being disingenuous. We're not there yet. We've not spiked the ball and done our victory dance on equality in this country. And as long as there's inequality and disparities in our education system, disparities in employment, disparities in the manner in which we reintegrate people into society post-incarceration, we're not going to fix this problem. So if we looked at this as a public health problem, how would we approach it differently? And I think we'd approach it fundamentally different.
Well, one of the ways you are trying to approach it differently literally is around a public health problem where you have, as we talked about before, 60% of the people in the jail have some kind of mental health issue. I think both of you, Chief, have tried to change the way your departments interact with the mental health system. Can you talk about a little bit about what you're doing and where you're seeing success and what's toughest?
Yeah, so for us in Tucson, and I'm sure the numbers aren't remarkably different in Pima County as a whole, about 1 in 7 of our calls involve somebody in a mental health or emotional crisis. And that means, we really have to have police officers trained and ready to deal with that as a first responder. We can't be the only responder, that's for sure, but we have to be a good first responder. And in that respect, the medical model really is helpful because it's almost, the first step has to be do no harm. And for a very long time, police interactions with the mentally ill throughout this country have been based on, frankly, and as a result of really not knowing, ignorance in many cases, or poor training has resulted in harm as the first level of encounter. And so what we've done here is, at Tucson PD, we've developed sort of a tiered approach to working with folks who are mentally ill. It starts with the idea that everybody in the department needs to be trained in what we call mental health first aid, which is kind of that primer, an 8-hour training session on doing no harm and on understanding how to recognize when you are dealing with someone in crisis. It goes on from there, though. Both our departments have crisis intervention team trained folks. They go through a 40-hour program that involves understanding the do's and don'ts of working with someone in crisis, as well as the resources that are available out in the community. And then we have another level of this, again, very similar model in both our agencies that at TPD we call it our MISS team, our Mental Health Investigative Services team. And these are a group of detectives. It's roughly, at this point, we're up to about 13 or 14 folks who are part of this team, who they serve the commitment orders when there's a signed order from a judge to take someone in for evaluation for mental health reasons, potentially individuals who are a danger to themselves or others. And in the past, and frankly still around the country, in many departments, these kind of commitment orders are handled by just line-level officers who, when they're going to a scene, they're in uniform, they're not necessarily trained on how to engage with someone. And so often those turn into confrontations, sometimes very dangerous events. Yeah. That's not the case here. Our MISS team detectives are in plainclothes, unmarked vehicle. They have extensive training. They know a lot of these individuals by name. They've worked with their families. They've worked with their treatment providers. And their track record on getting folks to come voluntarily is incredible. I mean, the use of force is almost zero. So now we're taking it even one step further, where we're teaming up these MISS team individuals, our detectives, with clinicians. They go out together to work with folks proactively. And their duties go beyond just the Title 36 commitments. They're also, when our officers, for example, are dealing with someone out in the community repeatedly who looks like they're a high risk to themselves or to others, or who's threatening, maybe someone who's creating a regular problem in a business downtown, they go and have a proactive interaction with them to figure out what's going on. How can we help you get back into treatment or to start treatment? How do we connect you to resources?
In the previous panel, I mentioned that in many communities, you hear law enforcement saying that the jail has become the mental health provider of last resort, and someone amended that to say that they feel like here it's often the mental health provider of first resort. Do you feel that way?
Well, to some degree I do, but I think that would undercut the good efforts of our community-based partners. We do have a lot of community-based resources here in Pima County, and I'm very grateful of that. I've seen that evolution in my career life of having more community-based alternatives. We didn't used to have these.
And you feel you have more now?
I think we're moving in the right direction. Yeah. There's still work to be done there, and I think we need to decriminalize the idea that being mentally ill is a crime. being addicted to narcotics is a crime. If you, again, go back to this public health perspective, you would view these things differently. One of the things that we're doing at the Pima County Jail is we realize that when we incarcerate somebody that has acute mental illness, we're able to stabilize that person in the correctional environment because they get on medication, they're in a structured environment. But what used to happen is we'd open the door and say, good luck. And they would go back into the community. We'd be surprised that they would reoffend. So now what we do is we provide that person 7 days of bridge medication. Well, that seems like a very common sense approach, doesn't it? A very common sense approach that has a very low cost point to the people of Pima County, but that allows the person to continue to be stabilized in the community until they can get to one of our community-based alternatives.
Let me move to another area. You are literally on the front line of the debate over the border and immigration and drugs and all of the related issues. I want to explore this from several different angles, but let me start by asking you, Chief. Does that create any unique public safety challenges for you? Are you facing specific public safety challenges linked to what is happening at the border?
I think it does create some public safety challenges. The last panel, there was some discussion about the amount of meth and opioids, heroin that I think really does come into this community in a pretty significant amounts. And so dealing with that is a challenge both from an enforcement and from an addiction and treatment standpoint. But I think the other real issue is that, you know, we are trying to be responsive as law enforcement officials to the political world around us. And we're in a community that, you know, so we can't be a sanctuary city per se under Arizona law. And I'm not even sure what that actually means because in most cities, even sanctuary cities, frankly, there is a level of cooperation between police and sheriff's departments around individuals who are dangerous or violent, regardless of what their documentation status is. Nobody wants those folks in the community. But what we're still left with then is a large segment of our community that really is fearful about dealing with the police. And so that means I think we have to go the extra mile in terms of reaching out to that community, making it clear we are not the immigration police. That is not our mission. We have neither the resources nor the desire to do that. We want to work with victims of crime regardless of what their documentation
So let me follow up by asking you first and the Sheriff. What is the proper level of interaction, cooperation that you have determined between SB 1070 and federal law? What do you think it is appropriate for your officers to do with ICE, and what is too far?
Well, I actually think the model that was put in place under the prior administration is closer to where we should be ideally, which is this priority enforcement program that recognizes that there are dangerous and violent individuals, there is gang activity, there is drug trade, there is human trafficking, that these are the kind of activities where it is appropriate to work with our Homeland Security, with ICE, with Border Patrol. I don't think most members of our community, regardless of what their status or their background is, would disagree with that. I think taking it further, moving local police into, for example, a 287G type program that essentially deputizes them to be immigration officials, I think that's a massive mistake. I think it undercuts trust in the police. It is, especially in a community like ours, I mean, this is really a low-income community. There are not a lot of resources for policing, treatment, other programs, and so to take those limited resources and to say suddenly we're going to be extension of immigration enforcement, I think that's a serious mistake.
Sheriff, what's the line?
Well, I think that we need to be, and I think that public safety is benefited by my department being cooperative with our federal partners without adopting federal responsibilities. My county is 9,200 square miles. I have about 500 sworn officers to patrol that area. I don't have the resources, nor do I have the inclination to adopt federal immigration responsibilities. Immigrants are not our enemy. Mexico is not our enemy. And we need to be honest about that. What is, as Chief Magnus, my friend, points out, is what is the enemy of public safety are transnational crime organizations, drug trafficking organizations, human trafficking organizations, and then we don't know about national security threats because our border is porous. We need to have a responsible and thoughtful dialogue about immigration in this country, and we need to divest local law enforcement from a discussion about immigration to a discussion about crime without respect to where it comes from.
So for people who are in the jail and ICE wants you to detain them, ICE detainers, you have said that is like a cocktail napkin, right? I mean, no legal authority. What do you do and what won't you do?
We will not
when ICE
detain
knocks on the door?
somebody based on an ICE detainer. It provides me no constitutional basis for extending detention of anybody. That being said, there is a window in which if we knew you had an ICE detainer on, we know you're going to be released, we would notify our federal partner. We're about to release Ron. He'll be released in about an hour and a half to 2 hours. If you still want Ron for a legitimate criminal justice purpose based on that ICE detainer, you're welcome to come and we'll transfer custody. If they don't get there in that period of time, you're on your own. We will not detain you 1 minute past that.
You know, you mentioned all of the genuine threats that you see, transnational drug traffic, human traffic, crime organizations. These are exactly the reasons the president says that there needs to be a wall on the border.
He's saying he wants a wall because he's afraid of illegal immigrants. Let's be real about this. This is not about public safety.
What would the wall mean?
I think the wall is a medieval solution to a modern problem.
Right.
But that being said, I think that we understand that we do need border security. And the thing that we don't talk about, and it frustrates the dickens out of me, is the human rights tragedy. My deputies recover about 150 bodies a year in the deserts of Pima County. This is a human rights tragedy. Many of these people will never know who they were. We'll never know where they are victims of the environment, bandits, coyotes. We know the level of victimization of people traversing the deserts of Pima County to come here for a better life. And I would challenge my conservative friends, and I've done this in public settings, if your family were impoverished, if your family were in danger, if your family were desperate, what would you do? And they'd say, I would do anything. Okay. Would you walk across the desert 60 miles in the heat to protect your family, to provide them a better existence? Of course I would. Okay. And a lot of these people will never know. My deputies recovered a skull out by Ajo this past week. We'll never know who that skull belonged to or what happened to that person. In all likelihood, that person was probably not of Mexican descent. It was Guatemalan, Honduras, El Salvador, and that person's family will never know what befell that person. This is human rights tragedy. We need to talk about that, and that's not even part of our
Bringing
dialogue.
the audience in. But Chief, let me ask you on another. You have been an advocate everywhere you've been of community policing, and there was a big push to encourage more community policing, particularly in the 90s. As you have tried to implement that here, what are the obstacles? What are the benefits, the rewards?
Well, I think my concern is that community policing also almost becomes a ubiquitous term that means sort of everything or nothing. You know, it really, you have to, if you're going to do real community policing, you have to create an environment in which officers have the time and the resources to build relationships on a geographic basis within neighborhoods, and you have to support that effort. Officers have to be specifically trained in really human interaction skills that go beyond technical kinds of problem solving that police are called on. And especially in this day and age, you know, with young people who are coming out of the academy that are better texters than talkers sometimes, you know, we have to retrain people on how to actually engage with each other and give them those skills and then give them, you know, if community policing is really important to a department, then you have to ask, are people being evaluated in that area? Are they being promoted or given special assignments based on how well they engage along those lines? A lot of departments talk a good game about community policing, but it's back to what the sheriff mentioned earlier, which is what they really count are, you know, the number of arrests or very typical measures of police.
And I was thinking that as both of you were talking before, which is whether it's by voters or elected officials who decide, you know, who to hire, are you being judged and measured by equity and the strength of relationships with communities? Or are you being judged by the crime rate?
Boy, that's difficult. I think you always be judged a little bit by the crime rate. Obviously, if homicides were up by 100%, the community would rightly judge us. based on that. But I'd like my department to be judged better on how we do our normal day-to-day activities. How do we better reach out to people? And you talked about community policing. Community policing has got to stop being a term. It's got to stop being a project. It's got to start being a condition. It's got to be a condition that permeates everything that law enforcement agency does. And it doesn't have to be a special bike patrol. It's a matter of how people pick up the phone and records when you need a police report. It's how an officer takes a burglary report. It's got to be a condition that permeates how you see yourselves and how you see yourselves engaged in the community. And you know, community policing as a term has been around my entire career, and it's really struggled to define itself. And I don't think we're there yet. I really don't.
All right, let's bring in the audience. There are microphones somewhere, I think. We have a question right here in the middle. Microphones are descending.
Okay, I'm Rachel from the Southwest Fair Housing Council. I'm really concerned about the conversations we've been having this entire time because we're sitting under this panel that's called Race and Justice, and most of the conversations we've been having, especially with this panel, are related to mental health. So it's like we're pathologizing kind of the way the people that go through our system instead of recognizing that our system is inherently racist and that we do have much more cops down in Southside and in the areas of town that are populated by people of color than we do in the foothills. So I don't know how you address that, what that means with community policing, with all the conversations that we've been having, but I think it's really important to recognize that the systems are racist. What are the systems going to do to no longer be racist?
Talk about.
Well, so just to answer your first question, Tucson actually doesn't, the city of Tucson does not include the foothills. So I can only cover the section that is the city of Tucson. But what I do strive to do is place officers throughout the community based on need, on calls for service, on ongoing crime patterns, and it's not based on any sort of racial demographic. That said, I don't disagree that we really have to deal with the issue of race and policing, which means, again, it has to come back to training, it has to come back to supervision. We've done unconscious bias training with our officers. We've done training related to procedural justice. We do ongoing training that involves putting officers in scenarios where we have real community members participating in those scenarios and giving them situations to deal with. We're looking at trying to get more complete input from the community that reaches into areas that have historically not had good relationships with the police. So look, we have to get beyond coffee with a cop that just involves the friendly folks that love seeing the police in the neighborhood. We have to look at how do we engage with young people, particularly of color, who are deeply suspicious of law enforcement, and try to figure out how do we build bridges there? How do we start conversations? And then ultimately, I think one of the measures of success is how do we recruit from those different neighborhoods and communities into our departments where people are actually serving the neighborhoods that they came from. So I get it. These are complex problems, but we do recognize that they exist, and I think we're trying to deal with them.
I would agree that we have a lot of work to do. There's no question. And Chief Magnus brought up the ability to recruit people into our profession out of minority communities is to some degree stymied by very antiquated rules that allow who can be certified by post. But I will share with you a story. Last night after I left our event, I was driving up Flowing Wells, and there was a motorcyclist laying in the roadway. Had just been in a crash. When I jumped out of my vehicle and I ran in front of traffic literally to stop him from being run over, I had no idea the race of that person. I did not know. That didn't enter into my calculus of whether or not I would risk being run over myself to stop somebody from being run over. I realize racism exists. To deny that would be disingenuous. But I don't think it is as systemic in the hearts of law enforcement officers as you might think. I don't think it is a systemic thing that we adopt. And I would reject it on that premise.
The argument, though, that you do here is that this, regardless of the individual, motivation of any individual officer, is that the sheer intensity of policing in minority communities produces kind of a level of surveillance that results in more arrests and accusations than you would see in other places. On the other hand, sometimes you're dealing with elevated crime rates. You said it's a complex problem. How do you balance that, and do you feel like you have an answer to that question?
Well, the very limits of policing in Tucson have an influence on that dynamic. Regardless of what neighborhood our officers are in, they can barely keep up with calls for service right now based on staffing. It's not like they have a lot of time to just drive around proactively and pull people over for whatever the reason might be. The struggle is to try to just meet the demands of the community to respond to calls. So, I mean, I think we have to keep talking about these issues. We have to make our officers aware of these dynamics. Part of it, you know, I continue to discover that there are a lot of officers who don't even understand the history of how race intersects with policing and why there is so much distrust. And so we have to have conversations about that involve the community. But again, I don't think there's one simple answer to this.
You know, the other thing, we need to look at the disparate crime rates in minority communities and look at employment. Other inequalities in education. You can't tell me that the education is equal at in the South Side as it is in the foothills. There are socioeconomic and racial disparities that exist that we need, again, to stop looking at law enforcement in this little island and start looking at this as a system. If you wanted to fix this, you would fix the system. And we need to do it as a public health crisis and try to keep the thing from not becoming ill first. And I don't think we do a very good job of being honest about employment, education, and equality disparities in primarily minority communities.
Let's bring in one more.
I'm Pat Watson, and I'm with the Southern Arizona Council for International Visitors. And I just want to take a minute and say that these two guys have put their officers with our international visitors to expand both our understanding of culture and theirs of ours, and I can't thank you guys enough. Thank you.
Let's go to the front row. We got one more here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Lucy Labosha. I'm a public school educator. I have a quick question. Are there initiatives in place in the city of Tucson that will allow you to actively recruit people of color to work within communities that we're talking about?
Yeah, and this is key. And again, it comes back to how do we reach into some of these neighborhoods, particularly communities of color, and get young people at least a foot in the door? For example, that period between 18 and 21, where folks are really deciding who they are and what they want to be, but where they also often get into trouble. We got to be bringing people into the police department, whether it's as interns, whether it's as explorers, whether it's in civilian positions of various sorts like community service officer. If we can get people to make an investment at that point and start building a relationship, then we can often hire them and keep them on as police officers when they turn 21. But we can also involve them in helping to facilitate some real discussions that need to happen with young people of color in the community about the dynamics of race and policing, which has got to happen.
With all due respect, that's in theory?
No, it's not. Yeah, these are real programs. It's not theory. These are things we're actively working on now, and part of the challenge is figuring out how do we get the word out on this and get more community members involved in helping us accomplish this, because we can't do it ourselves. The programs are for real.
The other thing that we need to do is to look at the requirements to become a certified peace officer in our state. They're antiquated, and they have a disparate impact on minority applicants. Whether it be minor drug use, minor crime that happened in the past, disqualifies people and has a disparate impact on minority applicants. And I am addressing that with Arizona Post.
Are those set at the state level?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So we're going to hear in a moment from the other side of the equation from a number of community leaders about their perspective and interactions with law enforcement from that direction. Would you join me, though, now in thanking Chief Magnus and Sheriff Napier? Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage the Reverend Demond Holt, pastor at the Pilgrim Rest Missionary Baptist Church. Grace Gomez, program coordinator for Reframing Justice at the American Friends Service Committee of Arizona. Lola Rainey, founder of the Tucson Second Chance Community Bail Fund. And Jacob Robles, a member of the community collective Flowers and Bullets. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome the Atlantic's managing editor, Adrian Green.
Hello. So as my colleague Ron Brownstein just mentioned, we have heard a lot about criminal justice today from some of the more institutional players, public officials, public officers. And we're here to welcome 4 community leaders who are thinking about how criminal justice in Tucson relates to other questions about access and opportunity. I just want to start off by asking everybody to describe the neighborhoods and communities that you're working in Tucson. What are the issues that people care the most about? You can start off down the line.
One of the great things is that is a serious concern in our community is we know for a fact it's not a myth, it's not a theory. We have done a horrible job on incarcerating people in this nation. We have too many people that are incarcerated, and specifically dealing with the people of color. Blacks and Latinos represent a huge population in our country in regards to being incarceration, not just nationally, but we also have a local concern in our county jails. A lot of our county jails are also creating poverty. We are towing people's cars, which is a vehicle to keep a job. You lose your job, you lose your home, you lose your home, you lose custody of your children, all because of incarceration. So we need to get much better on being comprehensive, innovative, in how we look at incarceration. We call our institution the Department of Corrections, but our prison is not correcting anything. It's more a Department of Punishment. So we have to do much better on how we look at incarceration.
Grace, Lola, I see you shaking your head.
Yes, I was going to say that, and I'm actually agreeing with what Pastor Holt said. And the thing is that we need, as a community, to look at who we're criminalizing, and we have been criminalizing poverty for a long time. A lot of the offenses that people end up in jail on are drug-related. So we do have a problem with drugs here, but incarcerating people is not the solution. We also have a problem with profiling people of color. Now, I live in what's called Browntown, south of 22nd Street, and we know that that's an area that police typically go to make arrests. So we have a disproportionate number of people of color who end up in the system. And so there is a problem with not only criminalization of people of color, but also criminalization of poverty. And understand, we have a lot of poverty in this community.
Yeah.
I work specifically with people who are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, and their families. My work really is around positioning directly impacted people to lead these conversations, not as add-ons, but as the primary drivers. So many of the folks that I work with, we all position things like employment, education, housing as the most important things when we're talking about reentry, and they are important. But I think that for everyone, and particularly people who have been directly impacted, what we're looking for is community. And that's something that's deeper, and that gets at the kind of heart center of who we are as human beings.
Jacob?
Yeah, I agree with what Grace is saying here. I think a lot of the things that I see that we're dealing with in the work we do in our communities, which is like primarily south of 22nd, Mexican, people of color communities, is just like a lack of those, not only those basic resources like housing and jobs and all that, but like even just alternate pathways, like the people that I've seen that I work with, when we introduce some of the things that we're trying to do, it's like the first time they've ever even heard like an alternate way of living or alternate way of community. So it's just like a lack of access to that and a lack of even knowledge of something different,
Absolutely. When we have a lot of conversations about criminal justice, something that comes up often is referencing public safety. And I'm interested in how you all kind of, in your different modes of working with the community, define public safety. Lola, I want to start with you. You were a prosecutor, and now you're working on advocating for bail reform.
Right.
Those seem like really kind of different parts of the criminal justice system. How has your personal journey changed how you define?
I think one of the things that's really important to know is that people of color who are, particularly through our system, are primed to become, agents of the white supremacy in this country. So a lot of us come in believing that we're doing good things for our community, but in fact, what we're doing is perpetuating the same policies and practices that have made it difficult for us as people to thrive and prosper. So, what you don't know, but once you do know, you need to do something about it, make a difference to change. And it's been a process of understanding just how much of a tool the criminal justice system has been and the oppression of people of color that's forced me to rethink my role as an attorney and as an advocate. And I think that one of the things that I would urge people to do, particularly people of color, communities of color, is to back away from the narrative of fear that the law and order advocates have been peddling for far too long. That they have us afraid of each other, afraid to be empowered to change, and the solutions are not going to come from the people who were on this panel earlier, okay, because they are invested in maintaining that system. The people who are going to change it are the people most impacted by that. And we have the ability, we have the imagination, we have the solutions. And calling 911 for people of color in this community is problematic. We have cops, only 40% of the cops who work in TPD live in the city. They don't live in the communities they police. Okay, that's number one. And so we have outsiders coming into communities that they do not see as communities that they want to protect, but they're there to come in with their guns drawn and with attitudes and with all these implicit bias against us in ways that create more problems than they solve. So we have to come up with solutions that allow us to figure out how to diffuse and de-escalate some of the I was going to say the tensions that breed the conflicts and violence that we deal with in our communities. And I think that's what I'm hoping is that we're going to have some amazing people with solutions. I think some of the young women in particular, I have been so impressed by the type of energy and fierceness I see coming from some of the young activists in our community here. So I'm hoping that they're going to be part of that solution.
You talked about people, building off of that, talked about people being part of the solution. Grace, you're actually helping to conduct a survey about what public safety means to the people of South Tucson. What are they saying? What are you learning from the people that Lola has such great hopes for?
Yeah, so that's work. It's a collaborative research project with American Friends Service Committee and Flowers and Bullets. And really, when we say things like community safety, public safety, or buzzwords like secure communities, it tends to conjure a certain set of meanings, right, that are typically associated with carceral safety, rooted in logics of banishment, right? But when you talk to community members about what makes them feel safe, what makes them feel protected, they say things like, my husband makes me feel safe and protected. Knowing my neighbor makes me feel safe and protected. One survey respondent said that Flowers and Bullets makes them feel safe and protected. And I think that's huge. It speaks to the work that young community organizers are doing in hyper-surveilled communities.
I want to talk some more about Flowers and Bullets. Jacob, public safety, we've talked, has a bunch of different meanings to a bunch of different people. And your organization does a lot of that community building, community growing. How do you think about public safety in developing those relationships?
For us, public safety definitely doesn't mean more cops and more policing our neighborhoods. My experience growing up in that community, even though it's been necessary and it's kind of like only solution sometimes in that sense, but policing and incarcerating has always led to like more and more problems, more and more issues. My family affected by those things for years on end, and whether if it's probation, continuing getting incarcerated. So I think for us, public safety is much different. Kind of alluding back to the survey Grace mentioned. It's that community, it's that, being connected to each other. The solutions are always within our communities and our neighborhoods. It's never very effective when outside sources and outside forces in that way come in. So, some of the work we're doing, I'm hoping is effective in that sense, in building that community.
I was going to say the Second Chance Bail Fund, which grew out of a movement by Black Lives Matter nationally to bring attention to some of the terrible things coming about because of the cash bonds, which was basically a way of holding poor people in jail because they couldn't post bond. And I don't think that people and across the country really understood how we were using poor people and continue to use poor people to fund the criminal justice system, the prison industrial complex. It is built on the backs of poor people. In Tucson City Court, for example, we have a lot of people who are getting who are being detained because they're having their licenses suspended for not paying fines. Well, they can't pay fines because they're poor. They don't have the money. Okay, so they get arrested. They go to jail, and so we have this revolving door of poor people coming in and out of Tucson City Court. Now, the MacArthur, it was not MacArthur. It was the Goldwater and ACLU. Both organizations came out with a very scathing critique of the municipal courts in Arizona because they said they are not there about justice. They are there to make revenues for the cities. So we are using poor people and running them through a criminal justice system. We have a full-time prosecutors, full-time public defender's office. All of that's being paid for by fines mostly and who are paying those fines? Poor people. Right. And so if we want to change things, we need to look at how we've allowed our local criminal justice system to get way out of hand. And we're the ones in charge of that. We elect the city council. We elect the folks who are supposed to be looking after our interests. And if we're going to put more money into courts than we do into kids, which we just did, shame on us, okay? Shame on us.
Absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit. Obviously, we are in Arizona, and so we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the border and immigration and how it influences this community. Grace, how does local law enforcement agencies have said that they're not interested in carrying out ICE raids and things of that nature? How do you see that actually playing out in the community that you work with?
Well, I think that some of the earlier panels have kind of addressed this in terms of escalating fear, especially in our current political moment. I think that for marginalized communities, again, these state apparatuses aren't necessarily where people seek safety anyway. There are really wonderful collectives in town that people turn to instead of the police. And that's historic, right? It's always been that way. So we have Derechos Humanos, we have Mariposas Sin Fronteras, and a whole host of other organizations that provide advocacy for folks who are undocumented.
Jacob, how do you see that playing out in the work that you do in your local communities?
Well, there's definitely a sense of like trust issues in that power dynamic with people that don't have papers and trusting authorities like not even just law enforcement, but just agencies in general. And so, I mean, that's always like a hurdle that people have to deal with here, you know, and yeah.
Well, I want to step back a little and talk about trust and in the wider sense. Obviously, trust between law enforcement and community of color and low-income communities, there's always room for improvement in those areas. That's not a shock to anyone. How do you kind of think about that in the work that you do? Pastor Holt, I want to specifically talk about the work that you did starting some programs that aim to foster a relationship between the police and youth of color. How difficult has that been for you?
Well, there's some difficulties, and then I think there's an opportunity where people are waiting for some type of hope where we can bridge the gap and build a relationship. We understand that our officers are to be public servants for our communities, not to just be enforcers that come into what we call the hood and look at people of color as always a threat. And so one of the things I wanted to do is build a initiative, which I did with the Boys and Girls Club and TPD, which Hoops with a Cop program is something that me and the former chief had worked on. And it was to allow officers to come in on certain days of the week, work with kids of color or kids in urban areas, so the kids can see that not all cops are bad. Now, I do have law enforcement in my family that puts their life on the line every time they go out to serve their communities. And I wanted them to see that that not all officers are bad. We do have some bad apples, and we do have to address that. But also, not only that, but they can also inspire to become police officers. Because another thing we need is we need more minorities on the police force. Kids need to see officers that look like them and also give them hope that they can come into the criminal justice system and change the system from the inside. Secondly, the other thing was to allow cops to see black kids and not see them as hoodlums or just something to get in criminal activity, but there are some good, inspiring, intelligent kids of color that's going to be the next leaders today and tomorrow. And so that bridge was to help them to be able to see that we can, in some type of way, come together. Make no mistake, we still have bad apples. When you get pulled over in a traffic stop and you've been mistreated, I'm going to tell you right now, that's not the time to challenge the police officer. You don't have the power at that time. Don't act stupid. Turn on the light if it's dark. Roll down the window. Put both of your hands on the steering wheel so they can see where your hands are, so they don't use that as an excuse to pull out their firearm. Afterwards, get that badge number and then go down and make the report. But don't act unseemly or out of order at the time, because we don't want any more blacks to be shot down unarmed.
Well, you don't seem to.
No, not at all, not at all. I'm with, first of all, I'm not only with Second Chance Belfast, I'm also with Black Lives Matter Tucson, and that type of thinking, that second-class citizen type of thinking, feeds into this narrative that cops don't have to be responsible. You know, if cops don't know that they have intelligent black people, they shouldn't be cops. Okay? We don't need to meet with cops to let them know that we got intelligent black people. If you still don't know that, don't become a cop. And the thing is, I'm a citizen. This is your job. You chose to do that job. You have supposed to have gone through training. When you approach me, you're supposed to know how to approach me in a way that protects you, but also protects me. Why do I have to do all this extra stuff to make sure that you're scared behind doesn't pull a gun? If you're that afraid of people, don't become a cop. Okay? Hold a cops accountable. Okay? Well, we do know that one of the leading causes of death of cops is suicide. Okay? We know that's a hard job. But if that's the case, then cops need to be working on what are they doing to identify people who are not emotionally capable of doing that job. What kind of other issues are they not addressing? And see, I don't think that you can really, reform a cop culture that's built on white supremacy. They're doing exactly what they were trained to do. Okay? They are trained to come into certain communities and behave certain ways. Now, honestly, if I was non-black, I'd say the system works perfectly, because I'm not afraid of cops. But I'm not. I'm a mother of black children. I have a grandson, and I am terrified. He's getting ready to learn how to drive and get his license, and I am just terrified he's going to be pulled over by one of the TPD cops out here who's got a lot of rage and anti-blackness. I saw how they treated the protesters in February of this year who were, doing what they were supposed to do. They were doing an anti-deportation march, and we had some really vicious cops show up, pepper spraying people and acting all kinds of thuggish, violent ways. If it hadn't been for the fact that they actually pushed down an 80-year-old white woman and some other folks and got that on video and it went viral, I think TPD would still be denying they did anything wrong. Okay? So we have a lot of police in this community who are not fit to be police. And I don't think having coffee and playing hoops with them is going to change that.
So let me say something.
I was going to say, you can respond.
First of all, I don't think anyone on the platform is here to attack anybody. The point that I'm making is that, yes, we do have bad apples. I believe bad apples need to be flat out fired. But the point that I'm making is that's short term. Being pissed off after 2 weeks is going to go back to being systemic. Doing a couple marches a couple weeks, after a couple weeks, guess what the system knows? After everything calms down, the whole system goes back to doing the same thing we were saying. So just to be angry, and I'm getting there, I'm getting there. The point that I'm making is we have to inspire kids of color as well to become leaders in our community. Now, you can say what you want, but at the end of the day, we don't have any blacks on any branch of government. We don't have any blacks on city council. Who's advocating for black folks on city council? Nobody. Who's on the county board of supervisors? Tell me one black person that is on the county board of supervisors, and I tell you, there's nobody. Where's the full-time black judge on justice court? We don't have any. The point that I'm making, where are blacks on the governing board school districts? We don't have any. The point that I'm making is you can get emotional, get ticked off, have a couple marches, but the system is going to still go back down to what it is. What we need to do is reverse the school to prison pipeline, start kicking all these black kids out of school and put them in juvenile detention centers, and then they can't get an education. We need more African American and minority kids to finish high school, go to college, go to law school, get in the criminal justice system, become a black prosecutor. What we have is when we look at nationwide, we got a lot of officers that have shot down African American unarmed men, and by the time it goes to the grand jury, it's dismissed before we can do anything. If we have more African Americans that will become prosecutors as such as what you were, or become into the judicial system, more judges, we start seeing reform. I'm sorry, we can't keep playing a game of checkers when the system is playing a game of chess for a mighty long time. We got to move on and start making
But you were part of that. You were on one of those discipline committees, right? I saw you at that meeting.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, how many cops got disciplined out of that situation where they were viciously attacking the protesters, okay? You know, like I do, Pastor Holt, that you are window dressing for a system that does not hold these cops accountable. They do not hold cops accountable. And they use people like you and other people in this community to make it look like they give a doggone. They are not holding these people accountable because we see them.
Pastor Holt, I think you both have addressed kind of forward-looking motions of what we hope for in the community. And we've talked a lot about the past and a lot about short-term reforms.
Yeah.
What are some longer-term things that we should be pushing for? You mentioned education, you mentioned the school-to-prison pipeline, you mentioned public health and food deserts and all of these things that these community programs are looking toward. What are some things that we should be focused on in the longer term?
Education, 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 education.
Jacob?
I mean, education's good, but I'm not an academic. I didn't graduate college or anything like that, so I feel weird advocating for that. I see similar things like that in my community, where, yeah, it's good to get educated, but like, where is that going to lead you? What are you going to do with that? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's building those alternatives, like kind of like, you know, what we do even in a small way with like food and community and things like that. Like, it's the alternative methods that are gonna have a bigger effect in the community. Whether if it's us talking about domestic violence, with the, we farm food and we make art and this and that, but we're able to have these conversations too, and I think that leads to more effective change, like in those specific families and people that we're working with. So for me, it's like just creating those alternatives because. Yeah, this system isn't really working for us.
Grace, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I think that, when we feel for the edges and the contours of what we all long for, right? It's a world where everybody thrives. Everybody without qualifiers. So regardless of race, regardless of whether or not you have a conviction history, that you can thrive and that your loved ones can thrive. So I think that requires different questions and different practices. So Dr. Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like in public, right?
That's excellent.
So what if that was our animating philosophy when we talk about the justice system, right? How do we create a system where we love one another, whether you have harmed someone or whether you've been harmed? And what if we order our communities that way too? I think that is a justice system. And the work of Flowers and Bullets and Tierra y Libertad, TYLO, the work that happens at House of Neighborly Services. I saw Dr. Andrea Romero in the room, the work that she does in South Tucson, the city of South Tucson. Those are people that are actually doing this work of building community and creating safety on the ground. So I think that, we're looking for environments where there's cooperation instead of competition. And I think that requires, a different imaginary.
I think that's it. We have to create a space where people can think of something other than what we've been doing because it's not working for us. And we have to be honest enough to say that.
Yeah.
And there's so many people vested in maintaining this system. And we do push back. I mean, I don't know how we could have voted for giving cops equipment. We already have a militarized police department here. We voted to give them more money for equipment,
Yeah.
but voted down a measure for kids to invest in children.
That's right.
That's this communities. There's something. So if we're talking about if justice is what love looks like, where is the love?
Well, that's, I think that's,
those are the questions that we need to ask.
yeah, being more expansive in what we understand
Yeah.
justice reinvestment being.
Yeah.
So what if we were siphoning money away from the police, from prisons, from detention centers, and putting it towards communities and community work, like Flowers and Bullets, like TYLO.
Tucson Second Chance Bail
Or
Fund.
Tucson Second Chance Bail
So
Fund.
I'm gonna put that out there.
What if we were funding that? I think that's how we create safe communities.
Even without funding, though, because I don't want to make this about the money. It really is about how we feel about each other as neighbors and how we view each other as neighbors. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's people either helping people or working against people. And I think that's when I say how did we arrive at a place where we're voting down a measure that invests in kids,
Yeah.
then that says something about our priorities as a community of people.
Yeah.
So I'm asking you, who is Tucson? What kind of community do we want? So if we want a community where we are not criminalizing poverty, we are not dividing each other along boundaries of anything south of 22nd Street is Browntown, and that's where we police and we withdraw resources and put them in the foothills. If we don't want that to be who we are, then we have to change that. And part of this comes to me back to our leaders who we elect to hold these positions of power. And they are people who apparently don't have a lot of vision of what's possible, because they continue to do what they've always done, which is to say that we believe certain people have more value than other people. And the proof is that is the institutions that we've created, like the Tucson City Court, like the county attorney we have who has incarcerated so many people and continues to do that, mostly on drug offenses at a time when we all know that we have a drug epidemic going on. So we are criminalizing people we recognize as having a sickness, okay, and we're making money off of them. But we support those folks. We reelected her. So as much as we want to talk about these things, I want to say, where are you in the equation?
We're about to go to audience questions in a moment, right after Pastor Holt.
Yeah, I would like to say that I think that there's been an illusion in our criminal justice system. We think we give life sentences to people that have been convicted of murder, but I think if you're still paying for a sentence after you've paid your debt to society and you were released from incarceration, and because you still have a felony, you can't get a job, you can't get housing, you have a death sentence on you. We need to quit giving out death sentences for drug convictions, armed robbery, small little crimes, because even if you do 8 years in prison and then you re-enter society, when you're trying to get a job to rebound in your life and take care of your family, say what you want, that is devastating to an individual to where they can't take care of their own. So it's like you're paying a 2 or 3 time different type of sentence, even though you paid your debt to society. So we need to have a comprehensive expungement program in Arizona that can help individuals when they come out of prison, that they can clear their name in some kind of way where they can get a job and get a housing and start back in your life. If not, we're going to increase recidivism, and we're going to keep the cycle going back over and over and over again.
Let's go to our first question.
Good morning. My name is Isabel Garcia. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I was 22 and a half years the legal defender, and I'm with an immigrant rights organization. My question to you is, you heard the 2 police chiefs earlier, right? And they talked about acknowledging that crime is a result, really complex social injustice and that sort of thing. How do we get that to the line officers who went to city council to defeat something that helped all poor people? Public transportation. I was there There was conversations about climate change, disability, people who need jobs, people who have a DUI conviction, have suspended license, on and on and on.
Yeah.
Transportation is a vital service. 2 weeks later, TPOA officials came in. That's the union of the police. It's not them, I understand. But how can leadership translate that message to their line attorneys who 2 weeks later went down and said, you know what, our cops need more money, all the typical stuff unions do, that's fine. But what did they end with? They said, why doesn't the public riders, the bus riders, take a hit as well? They need to take a hit as well. So I want to ask you guys, how does that bear on our Tucson Police Department union officers who went against the bus rider, help and caused the city council to charge bus riders more than they were going to the week before?
I would just say that goes back to the question of leaders and the city council, because the city council didn't have to listen to them. The city council could have did something different. And if they chose to give them that type of authority and power over the people who depend on that system and who don't have who are going to be impacted by the increase in bus fares, then we have the wrong people in those positions. And I think that's it. The fact that we have so many law and order types sitting in mayor and city council is a problem, because that means they're always looking for ways to increase the budget for them and decrease the budget for us. We want a council, we want elected officials who put higher value on people than they do on bullets and guns. And that's not allowed to ask, but if we don't demand it, it's not going to happen.
One more question. I'm Ashton Seepin from City High School. You were talking about how justice is love, but in a system where a great amount of our sexual assault cases are taken with a very light hand, how does justice and love play into that kind of serious crime?
I agree with you. I think there's a difference between accountability and punishment. So I think the fundamental question is, how do we hold people accountable in a way that is responsive also to people who have survived harm, right? I think when we have what we have as my mentor and boss, Caroline Isaac, says, when we have this adversarial system, it prevents accountability from happening. So you as a defendant, you're trying to get the least, possible sentence, right? How does that make you, or how can you hold yourself accountable to perhaps the harm that you committed if what you're trying to do is get out of this structure, right? So I don't think that the system works for people who have survived harm or people who commit harm. It's different questions, I think, that we need to be asking of the system.
And I think that what Grace was saying is absolutely right. You have to say, so what is the goal here? Is the goal to punish? Is the goal to heal? Is there a way to reconcile these two things? And these are the types of questions in our communities that we have not tackled, because we have been part of a criminal justice system that divides folks along, good and bad. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the truth of the matter is, there are things that are much more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. And families, there's sexual abuse going on in families, and so these relationships continue. What do we do about addressing the damage done and still allow families to come to heal, allowing people to be held accountable without destroying communities? And I think that's something that we're just now starting to recognize that we have not been doing at all, because if we lock people up, they're coming back out into the same communities they left, and they're going to maybe be around the victims again. What are we doing to really address the complex relationships that we have with people in our communities, some of whom are doing some pretty terrible things? A lot of it because some of them are sick and some of them are just doggone bad people too. I guess I said bad people, but there's some people who are really angry and hurtful and destructive people. So what do we do for communities that have folks like that living among them? Do we keep locking them up? We're building prisons and it's not solving the problem.
Yeah, I think that also, when you talk about love, another word that goes with love is respect. You can't say you love something or love someone, and you don't have a level of respect. So going back to the sexual harassment that we're seeing that's beginning to be this big epidemic we're seeing nationally and locally, it's still a divide when it comes to justice, the superior over inferior. So you have men that's doing these type of assaults, misconduct, and nothing's been done to them. And even though it's not in the court of justice, it's still a court of public opinion of how it looks. It still looks like famous people that have a name for themselves, that have a brand, can get away with mistreating young ladies and women in the workforce. And I'm proud of the women stepping up and crying out and saying, I'm not going to take this anymore. And that's what we need. But now we have to take it to the next level and say, is there some criminality piece to that? And why aren't they also being brought to justice as well?
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank.
I just wanted to add that there is like some great efforts out there in terms of like some of the work that Emerge is doing and some of the community groups that are doing work around like challenging male supremacy. Those type of circles like are crucial, and I think those are like the counter spaces for what you're talking about with the punishment and how does that work. Yeah, so I support those spaces, and I think those conversations need to happen more amongst us men.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank our 4 panelists. I think we've seen today that dealing with the complex roots of the criminal justice system extends beyond policing, and the work that the 4 of you are doing exemplifies that. So I want to thank you for coming, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Lola. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Tito, Pastor Holden. Thank you, Adrian. Thanks to Ron Brownstein and all our speakers this morning. This was an intense and important conversation and not an easy one. This is something that the Atlantic will continue to cover here in Tucson and across the country because there is clearly a sense of urgency. I want to thank the MacArthur Foundation once again for making this conversation possible. Mostly, I want to thank everybody in this audience. You've been a wonderful audience, and I know how precious all of your time is, so thank you for giving so much of it to us. A round of applause for you. I do have one last request before you leave. I think when you got here, you all saw that there were surveys on your chairs, and you're going to get an email from me in a moment if you haven't already, asking for your feedback. I suspect, given what we heard here today and what I heard from you, you're going to have a lot, and we want to hear it because it actually informs what we do in a very meaningful way. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tucson. Have a wonderful afternoon.